So in this segment, we're going to go through how to install the Gamebryo plugin into Maya and how to export out of Maya back into Gamebryo. So you've already installed Gamebryo, you've installed the Maya plugin, but your shelf doesn't show up here yet. You don't have any Gamebryo buttons. So the first thing you want to do once you launch Maya is go to Window, Settings, Preferences, Plugin Manager, and in here the two we want to click on are My Immerse. You want to load and auto-load both of these, and NI Multi-Shader. And you probably noticed as soon as I clicked on that we got the Gamebryo shelf up here. And also if you go to the Hyper Shader, you'll notice that the NI Multi-Shader node shows up at the top of the list. So now everything is in there correctly. So now we're going to figure out how to export out of Maya. And for that, the only buttons that we're concerned with on this entire shelf are the first 5 right here. And in order, these are your export options: export scene, export selected, preview scene, and preview selected. These last two, what these are useful for is if you're iterating on a model or some content and you want to see what it looks like in the Gamebryo viewer, you can just go ahead and preview. It'll write a temporary file and launch the asset viewer for you. You can see what it looks like. So let's go ahead and run through these real quick so you can see how they work. I'm just going to do a really simple scene, sphere. So before you export, you want to pull up your export options, and in here under export display options you want to go to change file export path, and we're just going to put this right on the desktop, call it test, change, save, and then I'm going to hit export all. And the first time you do this, it'll pull up your script selection. Make sure it's set to default export and just hit OK. We'll go over that later. Now this has been written to my desktop, and I'm going to go ahead and launch Asset Viewer eventually. There we go, and let me load that into here. And there we go, in the Gamebryo renderer, a sphere. Amazing. Also, instead of that, you can go ahead and preview it, and this is just going to launch Asset Viewer for you, so you don't have to launch it yourself. And it's also not going to save the file. This just gets written to a temporary file. And there's our sphere again. Huzzah. So for the selected, if you have, this is really useful if you have a large scene with a lot of different pieces and you just want to see some changes on one piece, but you don't want to have to export out the entire scene. You can do selected. So I'm just going to go ahead and create some more geometry in here, so we can see how this works. So I've got my 3 cubes and my sphere. So let's say I want to export just these 3 pieces and I don't want that other cube. What I can do is just select those, and I'm just going to preview it so I don't have to launch Asset Viewer. Hit Preview Selected. And once this loads up, there we go. We've got 1 sphere, 2 cubes, but it did not grab the 3rd because it was not selected. Also, when you do preview selected, this works on a hierarchy basis. So if I have these 2, if I can select them properly, parented to the sphere, and I select the sphere, it's going to export everything that's under the hierarchy in the sphere. So I don't have to actually go in and select all of these individually. So that's how to export quickly. Let's actually go through some of the export options here. So the first option in here is the export display options, and the most important thing is here is change file export path. Ran through this earlier. This just lets you put in a file name that it's going to save to when you actually export as opposed to preview. This checkbox here, prompt file path, if that's unchecked, then every time you hit export, it's just going to use whatever the last value was saved in here. And that is actually saved between files. So if you input a file name in one file, export, don't have prompt for file path, open up a new Maya file, don't put in a new file path, and it doesn't prompt, and you export, it's going to override your old file. So generally you want that checked, but the best practice is to always just go in here and every time before you export, input a file path name. Most of these options in here are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go through all of those. You can also, the scene viewer will tell it what to launch if you hit preview, whether or not it's going to launch asset viewer, animation tool, or what. For the time being, we're not worried about animation, so you just use asset viewer. And also the export for platform renderer. This is where you choose what your final output is going to be. It's set to generic by default. If you're doing something specifically for PC, you can have DX9, you can set to PS3, Xbox 360, whatever you want in there. So that's the export display options. Also above here you notice this update export scripts, and the first time we exported it asked us for a script. So let's go ahead and click on this and look in here. When you export, it actually runs a series of scripts to determine what output it's going to generate and how it's going to optimize that. This is set to default, and this is going to show you all the scripts that it's running. There's a bunch of templates already produced, and these cover pretty much everything you need. If you want to do a character, you can set it to the character export. If you're doing anything with PhysX, you can set it to the PhysX export. But sometimes you will want to go in here and edit what it's actually running. So let's click on Script Editor and take a look in here. This is also, if you want to look at any of these in detail, this is another way you can go through it. So if I go to my default character export, this will pull up a list of everything that's running. And also, down here, you can look at all of the scripts that are available to run. So these are the different scripts that it can run to actually generate output. These are processes that it's going to run. If you want to create ABV, that by default is in there. If you want to take it out, you can click on here and go to Remove Plugin. Also, if you look at any of these and you're not sure what they do, you can click on it and go See Description, and it's just going to tell you what that script does. And if you decide you want to add a plugin, you just click on it and go Add Plugin. And this order is accurate. This is the order it's going to run these in. So like right now, this is set to run after it exports. So that's going to be useless. So I'm going to want to move that up in the stack. And you can customize any script you want to run. You can save these out as a template that you can then use later. So if somebody else wants to use the same template, that's how that works. And then obviously I don't want to save any of that. So some of the other options in here when you export, you have your background color you can set if you really want to. Texture options, there's a lot of stuff in here that's really useful on export. So let's go through some of this. If you're using procedural textures and you want to bake those out to an actual texture, you can set the size it's going to do that. You can also control maximum texture sizes. So if you have a scene that has a bunch of 4096 textures, but you're looking for a really small file size, you can drop these down to like 1024 each. If I had number lock on, you could, that is. And then it will downsample all your textures for you, so you don't have to go into Photoshop and edit each of them by themselves. Save location for textures, by default, this is set to internal, in which case it's going to write all of your textures into the NIF file that it outputs. Some of the other options here are external, original. What this is going to do, if you're saving your NIF file to the same folder where your textures are located, it's not going to do anything. If you put the NIF file anywhere else, it's going to rewrite all those textures in the same location. And what this is useful for is if you have a bunch of textures that are going to be used between multiple NIF files, say you have 3 levels that are all using the same grass texture, if you have it to external original, you're just going to have one copy of that grass texture. It's going to save a lot of disk space to not have to rewrite those. External NIF works pretty much like external original. It's going to rewrite a copy of all those textures, but it's going to encode them in a NIF file. So if you don't want people looking at your textures or opening them up in Photoshop or whatever, that's useful as well. Set to internal by default. Unless you're working with levels, you'll probably use internal. The only reason to change it is if you have textures being shared across multiple NIF files. All of these have the same options. The texture properties all have the same options. It's just you can set them individually for whatever you set your output at under Export Display Options down here. And what this lets you do is, so say we bring in a bunch of targas uncompressed and you decide you want to save file space. You can go in here and set compression settings that it'll rewrite under. And you can also downsample here as well. So if you, instead of putting in a maximum size of 1024 or whatever, you just want to take every texture you've pulled in here and cut it by 1/4. So you want all your 1024s to be 256s. You can go in and do that there. And that's the same for all of them, but you can set it individually so that all your Xbox 360 textures are full size, but all your DX9 are half size or whatever. Below there, you've got your lighting options if you want to optimize your lights. These are some of your animation options for where you can set for what range of animation you want to export. We'll go over this more in detail when we actually do animation export and characters. But you can set those options in there. And then the last option we can go into is mesh packing profile. And this actually just, you can define how you want to store your geometry information. So if you want to try and save some space, you can change it to a default compressed mesh packing profile. We have a couple in here already. You can also go in and write these yourself. They're just an XML file. Pretty easy to write. But generally you won't need to use it unless you're really concerned with your footprint or if you're running into some performance issues. So I'll go ahead and cancel out of there. So that's the Gamebryo Maya plugin. and the export options.